For centuries, the border between Pakistan and Iran has been treated as a clean dividing line between two distinct civilizational worlds, the Persian-speaking heartland of one of history's great empires on one side, and the Urdu-speaking, cricket-loving, cricket-obsessed nation carved out of British India on the other. Two flags, two official languages, two entirely separate national identities, built around different founding stories, different modern histories, and most people would assume different peoples entirely. This border, stretching roughly 900 kilometers through some of the most remote and least studied terrain on the entire Asian continent, rarely receives anywhere near the attention given to South Asia's more famous dividing lines, the India-Pakistan border, with its heavily militarized checkpoints and decades of conflict, or the Durand Line separating Pakistan from Afghanistan, endlessly discussed in the context of regional security. The Iran-Pakistan frontier, by comparison, cuts through vast stretches of desert and mountain in Balochistan, a region so remote and so sparsely populated that most people, even within Pakistan and Iran themselves, rarely think carefully about what kind of population actually lives directly across this specific line. Scientists decided to test that assumption directly. Researchers compared genetic data spanning Pakistan's major ethnic populations against Iran's own remarkably diverse ethnic landscape, examining mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome lineages, and genome-wide autosomal markers across both countries. The question was specific. Given nearly a century of separate national development, separate governments, and a modern international border running for nearly 1,000 kilometers between them, how genetically distinct are the populations of Pakistan and Iran, actually? The answer researchers found wasn't a simple yes or no. It was something considerably more precise, and in one specific case, genuinely startling. While most of Pakistan's population sits clearly outside Iran's genetic sphere, one specific Pakistani ethnic group turned out to be so closely related to populations across the border that researchers measuring the genetic distance between them found it statistically close to zero, a level of genetic identity normally reserved for populations living within the very same country, not on opposite sides of an international border. This is the story of what scientists found when they finally compared DNA across Pakistan and Iran. To understand why this comparison even makes scientific sense to run, you first need to understand something about Iran that most people outside the region rarely consider. Iran itself is nowhere close to being a single genetically uniform nation. A landmark genome-wide study analyzing over 1,000 volunteers, representing 11 distinct Iranian ethnic groups, including Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Lurs, Gilakis, Mazandaranis, Arabs, and Balochis, found that Iran's population is considerably more genetically heterogeneous than previously assumed, with several major ethnic groups showing internal genetic variation actually larger than that found among Germans, a population frequently used as a benchmark for genetic diversity within a single European nation. Researchers running this analysis identified what they termed a central Iranian cluster, made up of Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Lurs, Gilakis, Mazandaranis, and Iranian Arabs, all showing substantial genetic overlap with one another, despite speaking different languages and maintaining distinct cultural identities. Evidence of a shared ancestral gene pool that has remained remarkably continuous across the Iranian Plateau for at least 5,000 years, and quite possibly closer to 10,000. This finding matters enormously for interpreting the Pakistan comparison, because it directly contradicts a common outside assumption about Iran, that a country conquered repeatedly throughout history by Alexander the Great's Greek armies, by 7th century Arab Muslim conquerors, and later by waves of Turkic-speaking populations arriving from Central Asia, must have experienced correspondingly dramatic genetic replacement alongside each of these political and cultural transformations. The genetic evidence tells a different story. Researchers running this genome-wide analysis found that while Iran absorbed enormous cultural, religious, and linguistic change across these successive conquests, adopting Islam following the Arab conquest and incorporating Turkic languages and populations in the north, the underlying genetic foundation of the plateau's core population remained largely continuous throughout, with limited genetic influx actually reshaping the deeper ancestral picture despite all of that historical upheaval on the surface. Language changed, religion changed, political rulers changed, repeatedly and dramatically. The genetic core of the Iranian Plateau's population, by contrast, changed only modestly, layer by layer, without ever being fundamentally replaced by any single conquering group. But not every population within Iran's modern borders fits neatly into that central cluster. The same research identified several ethnic groups sitting notably outside this core genetic grouping, showing evidence of more recent, distinct admixture from outside the plateau. And it's specifically at this boundary, where Iran's own internal genetic diversity meets Pakistan's equally diverse population, that this comparison becomes genuinely revealing. The Baloch population, straddling the modern border between southeastern Iran and southwestern Pakistan, represents the single clearest and most dramatic point of genetic continuity, found anywhere in this entire comparison. A comprehensive 2024 review analyzing mitochondrial DNA variation across 19 separate Iranian populations found something remarkable when researchers calculated pairwise genetic distance measurements between specific ethnic groups living on both sides of national borders. The genetic distance between Baloch populations in Iran and Baloch populations beyond Iran's borders, specifically including Pakistan, came back close to zero, indicating an extraordinarily high genetic affinity between these two nationally separated populations. Researchers running this analysis found the same pattern holding true for several other cross-border ethnic groups studied, including Armenians, Turkmens, and Azeris, living both inside and outside Iran's modern boundaries. But the Baloch case stood out specifically because it directly connects Iran to Pakistan, two nations with virtually no other population group showing anything close to this level of genetic continuity across their shared frontier. This finding lines up precisely with what researchers studying Pakistan's own internal genetic diversity, explored extensively elsewhere on this channel, have already established from the Pakistani side of the equation. The Baloch population within Pakistan consistently shows a genetic profile researchers describe as fundamentally West Eurasian, closely related to Iranian, Kurdish, and broader Iranian Plateau populations, with historical and genetic evidence tracing this connection to a documented medieval migration out of the Caspian region beginning around the 10th or 11th century. What this new cross-border comparison confirms, with genuinely striking statistical precision, is that this isn't simply a case of two separate populations happening to share some distant common ancestry from thousands of years ago. The Baloch on both sides of the modern Iran-Pakistan border remain, in a very real genetic sense, close to being a single population that a national boundary happens to run directly through. Not two distantly related peoples who diverged in the ancient past, but one people, still measurably continuous, whose only real separation is political rather than biological. Every other major Pakistani ethnic population tells a genuinely different story when compared against this same Iranian genetic framework. And the contrast is precisely what makes this comparison so scientifically informative. Punjabi populations, Pakistan's largest ethnic group, show a genetic profile dominated by Bronze Age steppe-related ancestry and deep Indus Valley roots, sitting considerably outside Iran's central Iranian cluster entirely. While Punjabi populations do carry some West Eurasian genetic influence, as this channel's earlier coverage of Punjabi ancestry established in detail, that influence traces to a different, later chapter of Central Asian contact, arriving through the Bronze Age steppe migration corridor rather than the specific Iranian Plateau lineage that defines the Baloch population and Iran's central Iranian cluster. A Punjabi individual from Lahore, in other words, carries measurably less genetic connection to modern Iran than a Baloch individual from Quetta does, despite both being citizens of the same modern nation. Pakistan's Parsi community, though numbering only a small fraction of the country's overall population, offers a genuinely fascinating point of comparison within this broader Pakistan-Iran genetic picture, one explored in detail elsewhere on this channel. Unlike the Baloch, whose deep Iranian connection reflects thousands of years of continuous regional settlement on the Iranian Plateau's eastern edge, Pakistan's Parsi community carries its Iranian ancestry through an entirely different historical mechanism. A documented, comparatively recent migration of Zoroastrian refugees fleeing Persia following the 7th century Arab conquest, arriving in South Asia roughly 1,200 years ago, and maintaining strict religious endogamy ever since. Genetic research has found Parsi communities in both India and Pakistan carrying a distinct genetic connection to modern Iranian populations, closer in several respects to Iran than to their own immediate South Asian neighbors. But this Parsi-Iran connection represents a fundamentally different category of genetic history than the Baloch case, reflecting a specific, comparatively recent refugee migration, rather than the kind of deep, thousands of years continuous regional population overlap found among the Baloch. Together, these two very different populations, the Baloch and the Parsi, illustrate that Pakistan's genetic connections to Iran aren't a single uniform phenomenon, but reflect at least two entirely separate historical processes operating on completely different timescales. The Sistan and Balochistan border region deserves particular attention in this comparison, because it represents the specific geographic zone where this cross-border genetic continuity has been most directly documented. This province, Iran's largest by area and one of its most sparsely populated and historically marginalized regions, sits directly across the border from Pakistan's own Balochistan province, forming a single, continuous cultural and geographic zone that colonial-era boundary drawings split between two separate empires and, later, two separate modern nations. Researchers studying genetic samples from this specific border region have found that Sistani populations, distinct from the broader Baloch ethnic group but sharing the same general territory, show genetic patterns, connecting them not only to Iran's core population, but specifically to ancient genetic signatures recovered from archaeological sites across the border in Pakistan. A finding that pushes the documented continuity across this particular frontier back well beyond the medieval Baloch migration timeline into considerably deeper antiquity. Sindhi populations, carrying 60 to 66% ancestry linked directly to the ancient Indus Valley civilization, sit further still from Iran's genetic sphere, their ancestry rooted overwhelmingly in deep South Asian civilizational continuity rather than any substantial West Eurasian Iranian Plateau connection. Pashtun populations occupy a genuinely intermediate position, carrying real and measurable West Eurasian genetic influence reaching up back. Through Bronze Age Indo-Iranian migrations, alongside a documented and separately confirmed thread of ancient Greek ancestry explored in earlier coverage on this channel. But even Pashtun populations, despite this layered West Eurasian influence, don't approach the near-total genetic continuity researchers found specifically between Baloch populations on either side of the Iran-Pakistan frontier. This pattern connects directly to something Iranian population geneticists have independently documented about their own country's demographic history, adding an important layer of context to why the Baloch case turned out to be so genetically exceptional. Iran's population, despite sitting at what researchers repeatedly describe as one of history's great migratory crossroads, a corridor connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia, and a landscape that has absorbed successive waves of Indo-European-speaking migrants, Arab conquerors following the 7th century Islamic conquest, and later Turkic-speaking populations arriving from Central Asia, has nonetheless maintained a genuinely continuous core genetic identity for at least 5,000 years, and by some estimates, closer to 10,000. Researchers studying this pattern describe it as genetic continuity despite geography, meaning Iran's position as a crossroads shaped its cultural, linguistic, and religious history dramatically, without correspondingly reshaping its underlying genetic foundation to nearly the same degree. This same pattern of deep continuity, researchers now confirm, extends directly across the modern border into Pakistan's Baloch population specifically, suggesting that whatever historical process brought Baloch ancestors into their current territory, whether through the documented medieval Caspian migration or earlier, deeper connections to the Iranian Plateau population itself, that process left behind a population that remains, genetically, essentially continuous with Iran rather than having diverged into something meaningfully distinct. This deep genetic connection has an even older historical backdrop worth understanding, one stretching back well before the medieval Baloch migration that historians typically cite as the community's founding event. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, at its height under rulers including Darius the Great in the 6th century before the Common Era, directly administered territory reaching into the Indus Valley itself, incorporating the region as one of the empire's easternmost satrapies, and establishing sustained administrative, cultural, and genetic contact between the Iranian Plateau and the northwestern edge of South Asia, more than 1,000 years before the specific Baloch migration event historians typically date to the medieval period. This ancient imperial connection, followed centuries later by the region's incorporation into successive Persian-influenced empires, and eventually by the specific Baloch migration itself, means the genetic continuity documented across this border likely reflects not one single historical migration event, but layer upon layer of sustained contact stretching back well over 2,000 years, each new wave reinforcing rather than replacing the genetic connections established by the waves before it. This deep genetic continuity between Baloch populations across the modern border also finds independent support from Y chromosome research conducted specifically on Pakistani Baloch communities, adding a second entirely separate genetic marker system to the mitochondrial evidence already discussed. Studies examining paternal lineages among Pakistani Baloch populations have consistently found close statistical clustering with Iranian and broader Southwest Asian reference populations, when compared against Central Asian, East Asian, and South Asian reference groups. The same broad genetic neighborhood as modern Iran, rather than the genetic neighborhood shared by Pakistan's other major ethnic populations. Finding this same underlying pattern independently confirmed through both maternal mitochondrial DNA and paternal Y chromosome analysis, using different samples, different laboratories, and different research teams working on opposite sides of the Iran-Pakistan border, gives population geneticists considerably more confidence in the finding than either genetic marker system could provide entirely on its own. There's a particularly interesting nuance buried within this broader finding, one that researchers studying Iranian mitochondrial diversity specifically flagged as scientifically significant. A comprehensive analysis of 19 Iranian populations found the mtDNA differentiation patterns didn't consistently follow linguistic boundaries at all, suggesting that language in this specific region never functioned as an insurmountable barrier to genetic exchange between neighboring populations. This finding matters directly for understanding the Baloch case, because Balochi, the language spoken by Baloch communities on both sides of the Iran-Pakistan border, belongs to the Iranian language family, closely related to Persian, but a distinct branch within that broader family. The fact that Baloch populations show such striking genetic continuity with Iran's core population, despite speaking a distinct language from mainstream Persian, reinforces the broader pattern researchers keep finding across this region. Genetic ancestry and linguistic identity, while related, frequently diverge from one another in ways a simple national or linguistic map could never predict on its own. The broader significance of this finding extends into practical present-day questions facing the Baloch population specifically, a community whose situation sits at a genuinely complicated political intersection. Balochistan, as a cultural and geographic region, is today divided across three separate nations: the Pakistani province of Balochistan, Iran's Sistan and Balochistan province, and smaller Baloch communities in southern Afghanistan, a division imposed through 19th and 20th century colonial-era border drawing, rather than through any natural cultural or genetic boundary. Baloch nationalist movements on both the Iranian and Pakistani sides of this border have, for decades, pointed to this shared identity as part of broader arguments for greater autonomy, or, in some more extreme political currents, an independent Baloch state uniting these divided territories. This genetic research doesn't resolve and shouldn't be read as taking any position on that ongoing and genuinely serious political question. Population genetics cannot determine sovereignty, and questions of self-determination belong to political processes, not laboratory findings. What the science does confirm with unusual clarity is that the underlying premise behind these cross-border identity claims, that Baloch communities in Iran and Pakistan represent a single, continuous people divided by artificially imposed modern borders, holds up remarkably well against rigorous genetic scrutiny, considerably more so than similar claims made by many other cross-border ethnic groups studied elsewhere in the world. It's worth placing this finding within the broader context of cross-border genetic research this channel has explored extensively across South Asia. The pattern researchers found connecting Baloch populations across the Iran-Pakistan border echoes, in striking detail, the same underlying phenomenon documented repeatedly across the India-Pakistan border as well: Punjabi Jat Sikh communities remaining genetically nearly indistinguishable across that border despite 80 years of separation. Sindhi Hindu and Muslim populations sharing 60 to 66% shared ancestry despite partition, and Kashmiri populations showing deep, consistent maternal continuity across the line of control. Modern South Asian and West Asian political borders, drawn rapidly across the 20th century through colonial withdrawal, partition, and geopolitical negotiation, consistently fail to align with the deeper genetic history of the populations they divide. And the Baloch case, spanning not the India-Pakistan border, but the equally significant and equally understudied Iran-Pakistan frontier, adds yet another clear, independently documented example to the same recurring scientific pattern. This finding also carries genuine practical significance for medical research and public health planning in both countries, beyond its historical and political interest. Understanding that Baloch populations in Pakistan share such close genetic continuity with Baloch populations in Iran means that disease risk research, pharmacogenomic studies, and genetic screening programs developed for one population are likely to translate with unusual accuracy to the other. A genuinely useful finding for two national healthcare systems that otherwise have almost no formal mechanism for sharing medical research data, given the limited diplomatic and scientific collaboration between Iran and Pakistan compared to collaboration either country maintains with other international partners. In a region where genetic reference databases remain chronically underdeveloped compared to Europe and East Asia, confirming this level of cross-border genetic continuity offers researchers on both sides of the frontier a practical shortcut. Findings from Iranian Baloch genetic studies can reasonably inform medical research and screening priorities for Pakistani Baloch communities, and vice versa, even without direct, formal scientific cooperation between Tehran and Islamabad. None of this diminishes the genuine, distinct national identities Pakistan and Iran have each built since the 20th century, shaped by different political systems, different official languages, different modern histories, and since 1979, a particularly stark divergence in Iran's own governance following its Islamic Revolution, compared to Pakistan's own distinct political trajectory as an independent nation carved from British India in 1947. Genetic continuity between specific populations on either side of a border doesn't erase or compete with the real, meaningful, and entirely legitimate modern national identities both countries have constructed. What the science reveals is something narrower and more specific: that the map of genetic ancestry across this particular stretch of West and South Asia was never drawn with the same lines as the map of modern political sovereignty, and that at least one specific population, the Balochs, happens to sit directly across that mismatch. carrying a biological continuity across the Iran-Pakistan border that few other populations anywhere in the region can claim with comparable scientific precision. For scientists, that is the result that made this particular comparison worth conducting so carefully. Not a simple confirmation that Pakistan and Iran are entirely separate genetic populations, which broad national-level assumptions might have predicted, and not a finding that the two countries share some vague, generalized ancient connection either. The genuinely significant result was far more specific. The discovery that one particular Pakistani ethnic community, the Baloch, shows a level of genetic continuity with populations across the Iranian border that approaches statistical identity, a level of closeness normally reserved for populations living within the same country, found instead spanning one of the region's most consequential and most frequently overlooked international frontiers. There's a final comparison worth drawing before the story closes, one that connects directly back to the broader picture this channel has built up across dozens of episodes exploring South Asian and West Asian population genetics. Iran, like India and Pakistan, turns out to be genetically far more internally diverse than its single national flag suggests. A central Iranian cluster of overlapping ethnic groups sitting alongside several more genetically distinct populations at the country's frontiers. Pakistan, similarly, contains genuine internal genetic diversity, rivaling entire continents when its 10 major regional populations are properly compared, as this channel's earlier investigation into Pakistan's own 10 regions demonstrated in detail. What the Iran-Pakistan comparison adds to this recurring picture is a genuinely new dimension, proof that these internal diversities don't simply exist independently within each country's own borders, but actually connect directly across them, with specific populations on either side of an international frontier sharing deeper genetic continuity with each other than either shares with fellow citizens living just a few hundred kilometers away within their own nation. The map of ancient human ancestry across this entire stretch of West and South Asia, drawn patiently over thousands of years of migration and settlement, was simply never going to line up neatly with the political map drawn hastily across the same territory within the last century. Consider what this means in genuinely human terms, played out across a single extended family living in this border region. A Baloch grandfather in Iran's Sistan and Balochistan province, and his cousin's family settled just across the frontier in Pakistan's own Balochistan carry citizenship in two different countries, speak with regional dialect variations shaped by decades of separate national education systems, and have lived under two entirely different systems of government for the better part of a century. Genetically, according to the research explored throughout this documentary, they remain close enough to register as barely distinguishable, closer, in the strict biological sense, than many people living within the same Pakistani province but belonging to different ethnic communities. The passport in each man's pocket describes a division that, at the level of the genome, barely exists at all. That is what scientists found when they finally compared DNA across Pakistan and Iran. Not two cleanly separated national populations, and not a single unified population pretending to be two, but something considerably more precise and more scientifically interesting, a shared genetic landscape where most Pakistani populations sit clearly, measurably outside Iran's core genetic sphere, while one specific community, spanning the mountains and deserts of Balochistan on both sides of a colonial-era border, remains close enough to be, genetically speaking, essentially one people still, divided today by passports, currencies, and governments, but never at the deepest biological level science can measure actually divided at all.